Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Coaching the Bible. This is episode 231, season 5, episode 18. We're moving into a different series, a different section, a different moment in time in the story of the Exodus. And it requires of us some new thinking and some new imagination and some new ideas. And we're going to now establish what I would like to say is something I'm calling Beyond Sinai. Beyond Sinai is the idea of after the people have left and after they have survived the Egyptians and seen the Egyptians destroyed, and after they have been at Sinai and had the revelation, accepted the commandments, said what they talked about last week, we will do and we will listen. There's now the next part. And the next part, typically speaking, when you read the rest of the book of Exodus, excerpting out, it's hard to do, but excerpting out the story of the golden calf, it's very technical, it's very detailed, and it's focused on really two stories or two events. It's the building of the tabernacle, what's called in Hebrew the Mishkan, and the priestly garments, the clothing of what are called in Hebrew the Kohanim, the priests. And I think for a lot of people, it loses the cachet, it loses the interest, and it separates those who are really, really focused on getting through every word and every verse and every text and every comment, and those who are quote unquote just around for the stories. And so I wanted to establish and see if we can put together a sequence of sessions on the second half of the book of Exodus and extract from it not just global principles in leadership, but very specific action items in leadership. And I have this idea that's called Beyond Sinai. And how do you go from vision to execution, from leadership to legacy? How does that work? That's the idea here. And so session number 1 is called From Blueprint to Breakthrough. All right. I love all the cool titles, but we'll get into the specifics. We're moving from strategy into actions. And so this is what's important here, because what reality is about leadership, and all of you out there who are leaders know that leadership is not a singular moment. It is, in fact, a progression. And it's, in many cases, a very long and slow progression. Even if somebody, quote unquote, shows up in an instant for a moment, it's not that they showed up in an instant for a moment, but that they were working towards that over the course of many years, and then they were ready for the moment. And so at the end of Exodus, we're witnessing this transformational shift in leadership. We're going from a charismatic, centralized leadership in Moses to a structured governance. We talked about Jethro and his advice and his consult regarding the judicial system. We're moving from the law and the principles. If you want to think about the Sinai moment as law and principles, Moses up there for 40 days and 40 nights, receiving the law, now coming down, teaching it. And now we're going to a structured execution in the building of the tabernacle. And now we're going from what you would call vision-driven leadership. It's something that's out there, it's something that you see, to something that has to be sustainable and something that's more of what we might call today institutional leadership. And this matters because this really cuts across small areas where people are, in fact, leaders. They're basically facing very similar challenges. How do you take a vision and turn it into some sort of a structured reality? How do you ensure buy-in, execution, and then sustainability? How do you build something that lasts well beyond you? And so the end of Exodus in actuality is this incredible leadership framework. It's not just history that covers all of these things: establishing governance, mobilizing resources, creating structure and responsibility, and transitioning leadership from individuals to institutions. And so what we're going to do over the next number of weeks is we're going to cover all of those. We're going to mix and match between the different portions, let's say, because they basically cover the same things, other than, again, excerpting out the golden calf story, but really get a sense of how that looks. We're not going to get into all of it in one day. It's simply not possible. But what we're going to do is cover as many of those things as possible over the course of a series of sessions on this leadership framework that I'm calling, again, Beyond Sinai. And so we already dealt with the first piece of this puzzle, which is Jethro and his advice and setting up the legal structure, because the legal structure also established a leadership structure for the people and very much moved it from singular centralized individual to a set of hierarchies, or almost like a you might want to call it almost like a pyramid structure of different levels of leadership. I hate to use the term pyramid because I think people think Ponzi scheme. Ponzi scheme. It's not a Ponzi scheme. It's very much a leadership structure that works its way up to Moses. It works its way down from Moses as well, but it's a two-way street up and down, and that allows for a decentralization and allows for Moses to focus on the grander, larger pieces of the puzzle, which we'll talk about in just a second. So session one, what I'm calling, let's call from governance to execution, is the instructions for the tabernacle. Moses receives the divine instructions for the tabernacle, the Mishkan, at Sinai, and now he's shifting it. He's helping the people shift from revelation, that revelatory moment, to a structured implementation. So if the tabernacle is some sort of a physical representation of the Sinaitic moment, it's bringing God into the camp, and it's turning it into now a structured leadership system, and it's an allowance of taking that vision into execution, into a real decision-making framework where everyone can actually operate and ultimately succeed. And when you think about it as an individual leader, if you just have vision, so that's amazing and it's beautiful and maybe it's inspiring, but without the execution part, implementation piece, it's almost meaningless. It's just nice ideas. So we have to move from one to the other. So for the people to become a leader nation in the world, for the people to implement the covenant, for the people to be a light unto the nations, for lack of a better term, it cannot stay in vision stage. It has to move into execution mode. It has to move into reality. And so that's really now step one. Part two after that would be the mobilization of resources and collective ownership. So this is now the call for voluntary contributions, the appointment of Betzalel and Aholiav to lead the construction, the buy-in from other people, getting voluntary contributions, delegating it out to many, many more people to participate, because you're creating ownership in that space. So you moved from just having leadership structure to having the physical manifestation to getting buy-in, because you need ownership from the people, not just compliance. So that's step two. We'll talk about that in maybe next week. Number three is then leadership symbolism and a sacred responsibility. All these are going to get even cooler names as we get forward. But now that's the symbolism, and the sacred responsibility is the idea of having a priestly group, and that's the design of the priestly garments, because those special garments symbolize their unique role, the unique responsibility, their level of accountability to the people and to God. They play that almost intermediary or intermediate step, helping the people reach a level of sanctity and spirituality and sacredness, but it has to be unique, it has to be special, and it stands alone. And so here, we have to appreciate that leadership carries weight, and therefore the symbols and the actions around that matter. And so you're now progressing. You moved from the building itself to the buy-in to the leadership structure getting even more specific because of the sacred level of responsibility. And then you're moving into transition and sustainability, where now if the tabernacle is completed and Moses transitions from direct execution to overseeing and enduring the self-sustaining system, because that's really what happens now, right? Once the tabernacle is established and up and running, Moses doesn't run it. The priestly class, his brother and the entire Aaron family line, they run the tabernacle. So people are now running a lot of their spirituality, their spiritual experience, not through Moses. So it has decentralized. And so now it's a handoff, and that establishes longer-term sustainability, because true leadership builds beyond the individual. So now as you see that progression, it turns the second half of the book of Exodus from something that is, for some people, uninteresting at all, into an incredible leadership framework build, an architecture for great leadership, which then sets off an incredible amount of leadership ideas going forward. So we've already done part one, which was Moses starting the legal system on his own, Jethro coming in, That helped to begin the process of delegation, of decision making, establishing the structure, leadership governance, and a more sustainable system. But it's really just the beginning. And so now we have to think about how do we move from that governance piece to an execution piece. And that's really where session one comes into the process, from governance to execution. How do we move from that, the general strategy, into action? So part one is putting in this structure of hierarchy, of leadership, of management, of communication up and down that ladder, but it has to be more than just ideas. And so famously in the book Measure What Matters, John Doerr has said, it's an incredibly good book, I recommend it for anyone who's trying to build something. Ideas are easy, execution is everything. The people and Moses are standing at a very pivotal moment in their journey because, as we said, the law has been given, the structure of governance, at least the legal governance, has been established, and the rules per se have been codified to a degree. It's an ongoing and a developing reality over the course of millennia, but at least the first stage of it for them at that moment. So how do we take that divine directive, the covenantal moment, the signing moment, and put it into the functioning system? That's actually the idea of a tabernacle. This is the first major test of the people's ability to take the mission and execute it in an organized, structure, and sustainable way. How do you move it from the abstract into the real, from the vision into the world? And I imagine this is not unique to the story of the Exodus. This is what great leadership is made out of. This is someone having a vision, having that vision and making that vision actually come to life. It's a version of Peter Thiel's idea of 0 to 1. How do you ensure also that execution stays aligned with the original intent? So now you have this vision, and you want to make it practical, but the practical and the real always have to tie back to the original vision. You have to make sure that those lines don't get blurred and that there's a direct correlation, a direct relationship between the idea that you have expressed as a vision to the manner in which you're trying to execute it. And then how do you balance delegation with oversight to ensure that the quality and the accountability is there? This is what great leadership is. And then so here in this session itself, the remaining time that we have, we want to define the mission in practical terms. So we're translating that vision into clear steps. We want to assign a level of leadership and responsibility, who owns what and how do we empower them? And then 3, we want to ensure accountability and the discipline in execution. How do we make sure that they're executing at a high level and a high quality? And so here we start with the vision. And so now we're defining the mission in practical terms, and we're putting it into action. So the Mishkan, that's the Hebrew term for the tabernacle. It's an easier word to say than tabernacle, is described in, initially in abstract terms, like it's, built for me a temple and I'll be there. And without the specifics of it, it doesn't work. We have to see it has to happen. It has to come to being. And so Moses receives the detailed divine instructions of how to make it. And they have to move from the conceptual, almost the blueprints, right? That's what we said, the blueprints, to the breakthrough, from the blueprints to build a fully built structure that is actually a place where God can reside, for lack of a better term, and the people can go there and meet God in God's place. And so the challenge isn't just building the structure, it's also making sure that every person involved understands the mission, understands the purpose, understands their role in it, and again, very important, ties back to the original vision. Those things have to always tie back to the original idea, making sure that all those things are clear and that it's a direct line from one to the next. And so the Bible tells us in chapter 25, they should make for me a sanctuary and I'll dwell among them. Famous verse. According to all that I will show, the pattern of the tabernacle and the pattern of all its vessels, so shall you make it. So the vision, 2 things here. The vision is divine, but the execution of it is human, right? You shall make it. God gives the pattern, And Moses has to make sure that the people quite clearly understand what has to happen, how that works. And so now you're going, as I said, from big idea, this is just like you, leader, from big idea to operational blueprint. And now you're breaking that blueprint down into step-by-step execution. You're making sure that there's real clarity over relying on the assumption of clarity. That's super dangerous. Your team cannot execute what it doesn't fully understand. So making sure that everyone is clear on what the job is, what their role is, and then making sure that everyone is aligned around the mission. Making sure that everyone has clarity of the mission, clarity of the role, and that they're fully aligned as to what everyone's role is, what the responsibility is, what's expected of them, and how will you know that they got there. This is like everything. CEOs and founders breaking down strategy into quarterly, monthly, and weekly execution plans. In the modern moment, to not get political, but just for a second, it's Elon Musk asking federal workers to write an email that simply says the 5 things they got done this week. You want to clarify what success looks like. I'm not saying that what he's asking is biblical, but the concept is making sure that there is clarity and alignment around what the job is, what the tasks are, what was accomplished. Okay, anyway, getting out of the politics. Leaders must clarify what success looks like. What does building a Mishkan, building a tabernacle actually mean operationally? Like, how do you actually go about doing that? And then making sure that in the course of the process of the building, that in the execution of it, that there are regular check-ins and there's a feedback loop to make sure that everyone stays in line, that there is not misalignment that comes in. There isn't just assumption that's there, but that everyone is on the same page, operating in some sort of congruent line that makes sure that everyone succeeds. That's super important. That is not abstract out there just for a tabernacle in the desert. That is how you're leading every single day. So the action steps for the leaders, you're breaking down the initiatives into clear milestones. You're defining key metrics, what you can measure, right? What you can measure wins. Ensure that every team member understands how their role fits into the picture. So that's part 1 of this very large structure that we're trying to build. It's not even the full session of session 1, because now we have to assign leadership roles, which we'll get into much greater detail next week when we talk about buy-in. But I have to make sure that everybody owns what they're supposed to own. Everyone knows what they're supposed to do. Everyone has their leadership responsibilities clear, and that it's assigned to where it's going to be. So Moses cannot personally oversee every aspect of it, the same way that a leader in a company can't either. And so you need skilled experts, people, artisans, or people who are willing to become artisans and craftsmen to be able to build what has to be. And so he brings in project managers. And so that's Bezalel and Oholiab, who are appointed to lead the design in the building. They're the project managers for the building of the tabernacle. This is a critical shift. One might have assumed that Moses was going to do this as well, the same way that one might have assumed that Moses was always going to be the one who's adjudicating and judging all the time. It's a shift. It's direct control to strategic delegation. So now he has people who are running the building of the tabernacle. He can check in with them. They can send them communications. They can send them emails. He can check the Asana and the project management software, Monday.com, to make sure that everything is progressing and that the timeline is good and that they're on budget. But he doesn't have to be in all the details, because if he's in all the details of it, then the rest of the nation suffers. And so we have to appreciate that Bezalel, when you look at the text, they're chosen not just for technical skill, but also because they have wisdom and leadership. Parentheses, he's really young, but it's okay to appoint young leaders. Aholiab is the second in command. Again, you have 2 people. It cannot be one person. I saw somewhere talking about startups, the idea that startups that have partners as co-founders are more likely to get funding than when it's a single person. I think there's something to the idea of co-leadership, appreciating that people bring different aspects to leadership, to the execution. So you have 2 people here. And then you have other workers who are given wisdom as well and skill to have what's effectively a fully distributed leadership model. So you have Moses, who is the CEO of the company. You have the 2 project managers. Then you have people who are tasked with specific responsibilities underneath the project itself. This is incredibly delegated out. And reality here is that delegation is strength and not weakness. The leaders who really fail to delegate create the bottlenecks and really limit progress. And putting the right people into the right role at the right time with the right skill and the right wisdom really puts you in a position, in a position to succeed. So the mission success is tied directly into Moses trusting the team, because Moses has let go. He's given it over and he's allowing the team itself to lead. If this stuff starts to resonate and make sense to you, then you can appreciate that the second half of the book of Exodus is not just random detail. This is how you build structure. This is how you build frame. This is how you build for the sustaining long term. Look, what we're still here, millennia later. And so that's part 2 of the sequence. I'm running a little long on time here, but let's get to part 3, because we're going to talk more about ownership and buy-in next time. Here, we'll talk here now. Part 3 of this is if you're talking about, right, part 1 is just a quick in-game summary, right? We want to translate the vision into action. Number 2, right, we talked about here, is assigning leadership and responsibility. And number 3 now here is ensuring accountability. How do you maintain that execution discipline that day after day people are going to come to work and people are going to do what they have to do, and you're going to execute at an exceptionally high level on a sustained basis? It's very hard to do, right? It brings up the famous quote from the book Atomic Habits. It's amazing how fast this quote became famous from James Clear. You do not rise to the level of your goals, you fall to the level of your systems. I am feeling that very much right now for myself beyond the scope of today's episode. But people have to appreciate that when the work is completed, they brought all the work to Moses, right? So they had built the walls, they had done the covers, they had built the ark, they had, done everything necessary for the tabernacle to be fully established. But they brought all of it to Moses, and then Moses does a check. He reviews everything before accepting it. There is a sense of oversight. And in theory, if it wasn't up to snuff, didn't meet the standard, wasn't executed to the degree necessary here for this to work, he probably could send it back. There's no assumptions that it was done right. Execution is to be checked. Execution has oversight. There's quality control in the leadership structure. And there's effectively the role of feedback in the execution, because if something wasn't right, then it would go back and get done again. Same thing for you as the leader. Can you create the structured review process? Do people appreciate how and what they're going to be measured on and checked on and reviewed on with respect to their role? Can you be sure? Can you try and add in layers where accountability exists at every level? So that's, it might be what you call, what we talked about, I think, in episode 1 of Coaching the Bible. There's a vertical level of accountability and responsibility, and there's a horizontal level of accountability and responsibility. So you're responsible to the people above you, and you're also responsible to the people who operate at the same tier, at the same level of you, because they have expectations of you, you have expectations of them, and without each of you, it's simply not possible to succeed. Can you establish a milestone check-in structure to be sure that we don't get to the end and realize that we missed the middle? And doing this way sets the proper standard and sets the execution into a space where it operates at a very high level without it being micromanaged, because everybody is crystal clear from the beginning about how all of this works. And now what you've done here, in again, part 1 of the process, is become incredibly clear about how we move from the blueprint to the breakthrough, how we get from the idea to the reality, and from the vision to the ground, and build something that's going to be long-lasting and sustainable for the long term. And so that is part 1 of our leadership framework structure build for the eternal. And that's where we are at the moment. That sets us up beautifully for the appreciation of what's to come next in next week's presentation on mobilizing resources and collective ownership. So again, just to quickly sum it up, we've defined the mission in practical terms. We've assigned a level of leadership and responsibility. and we're doing our best to ensure accountability. And this is a massive shift. Moses is no longer the sole executor. Sorry, when I write these words out, sometimes I can't read them. Oh, yeah. Okay. He's empowered others to lead. The mission is no longer theoretical. It's moved into structured reality. And it's no longer just simply about survival. This is about building something that will last. But even with the right leadership in place, and even with that said, execution does not happen without buy-in. And this brings us to the next piece of the challenge, which is what we're going to talk about in our next session, which is not going to be today. How do you mobilize the people to invest in the mission? How do you turn passive followers into active participants? That is what we're going to cover next week in session number 2. We're talking about mobilizing resources and collective leadership. That is Coaching the Bible for this week. I hope you have a wonderful, wonderful weekend. Beautiful, beautiful weekend. Look forward to seeing you next week as we continue in understanding the move beyond Sinai.